focused a lot on toxic doms, and so I want to make a video on the equally toxic kind of subs. And I want to focus on this because the toxic sub enables the toxic dom, and they also show up in erotica. And what that does is, like I said, with how there's a glamorization of abuse in terms of the dominant man who can be both the push-pull danger with the protective, stable, ultimately has your back kind of character, and how this subliminally makes you think that people, when they push-pull, there can still be a level of overall love underneath it. And of course there can, but so I wanted to talk about the characters that are opposing this, the kind of narcissistic dom that appears in erotica. Now, by contrast, the kind of submissive girl in these books, I would say, is defined by the outward bravado of absolutely hate being dominated, but subconsciously their biggest desire is, of course, to be dominated, to be told what to do, to surrender to a person worthy of trust, but then also still provides excitement. But what they also actually present in this book is someone who thinks that they are finally going to be able to let go when they are kidnapped and completely at the mercy of someone, and then there's no way they can be blamed. There's no way that they can be held responsible for this desire, which is to be taken. So what I'm trying to say is there's actually a deep desire to kind of be like a submissive, a slave, those kinds of things, captive, but not have it held against them as a good feminist. Because in culture, everything's about, oh, are you a good feminist? You've got to be almost hyper independent. You got to always choose yourself and your career over a man. And if you have any of the kind of former worship, devotion, surrender, I'll do anything you say, kind of, if any of those ideas are expressed toward a man now, that woman is basically burned at the stake for being kind of look at how people treat Lana Del Rey. People are polarized against her. They are enraged at her admission of kind of being consumed by love in a devotional way, right? So this psychology comes into play when you see the submissive character in these books. It's like finally they can admit the taboo desire to let go in this way and not be judged by culture because, oh, I was kidnapped, had no choice. So there's an abdication of responsibility that is almost so it's absurd that a woman has to be put in that type of situation in order to just admit that she'd love to, worship, devote herself, surrender, anything you say, a woman cannot admit that desire in her, that aspect. So she has to disown it, and then it can only really come out in these storylines. And then of course, even when it does come out, we have to have this tension of her resisting and hating it. But really, the whole time when we're reading it, we're like, you don't really hate it. You like it. You like it. Are you going to admit it? Are you going to admit it? Oh, you're close. You almost admitted it there, but not quite. You're still doing this kind of bravado of being like, and sometimes it is a battle between your conscious and your subconscious, of course. And also it is a legitimate, of course you don't want to be somebody that surrenders to a kidnapper. I mean, yeah. But what we're seeing in this is, actually a rationale that any person who gets into an abusive dynamic who's the victim, they sometimes almost have the story in their head of this vampire. I mean, that's redundant, but this horrible person that made me do this. Okay, they didn't make you do that. You enabled it by your fear of almost going against this type of person is so great. In fact, it is annihilation to you. Like the negative emotion of you asserting, hey, I'm not comfortable with that. That's so scary to this kind of personality that they would rather just go along with the narcissist, kind of act like, oh, but he made me do it. I'm an abuse victim. I'm a martyr. Oh, and that's not true. There's a shadow side of this character, of this kind of the sub, the empath, the codependent, many names for what you could call her. She does not want to take responsibility or acknowledge the fact that she fears negative emotion to the point of annihilation, so that she'll do anything not to have it happen. So much like the narcissist Dom character, kind of annihilation to them is that their false self is a sham and they can't admit to their shadow. So annihilation is being wrong. And then to this person, annihilation is being, having the experience of almost disagreement or a potential of a confrontation or a fight feels like annihilation. So I'll go with this story. Now, in these erotica situations, it actually is life or death. So of course, like you're going to agree, oh, well, you're right. You really can't go against this person, right? But it's playing out what's essentially this kind of rationale between this dance of the empath narcissist, that codependent narcissist, whatever you want to talk about, dark triad, there's so many words we could use, but essentially this dynamic that is presented is glamorizing a situation, but also giving freedom and giving stakes to what is actually an internal battle that people go through in relationships. And especially people that get into abusive dynamics, there's a tendency to really get into that either or of this person's a definite villain and I'm the victim of them, but you're choosing to continually avoid the confrontation and the negative emotion to the point where you are choosing to be in this dynamic. You are choosing to go along to get along to the point of absurdity. And it's all because the empath, the codependent, the people pleaser, they are so fearful of addressing and getting someone that may have a different point of view, especially if it is a dominant, because their threat is anybody that threatens their perspective of the false self and their control. And so intuitively the empath knows that they're going to rise up and be upset, and they fear that upset because that upset might have been a person who lashed out in a physical or verbal way. I mean, there's a context to it, probably. I mean, we've used different things as annihilation because at the time they did happen, they probably were. Anyway, so what I'm getting into is when we see these situations played out in erotica, we have certain archetypes, and the codependent archetype in erotica is is romanticized in terms of there's usually, it's a woman who has never been able to let go in the precise way she's wanted to, and she's so disenchanted, or she's bored with the vanilla relationships she has. Like, oh, they're perfectly nice, but she wants that little bit of darkness. And so that's kind of the frame we're introduced to her in. That kind of longing, I want much more than this provincial life, kind of Beauty and the Beast thing. You know, she's running around in the town, she's reading all the time. She's read all the books in the library, Belle. And then she's singing she wants much more than this provincial life. What does she get? She gets a beast. So, who also gives her more books to read too. It's great. Anyway, this character, though, does not take responsibility for her own wants, but then can have a convenient scapegoat to blame for choosing, lack of choosing is making a choice. You know, this passivity of not wanting to just be decisive or own who you are, what you want. Well, then you end up with somebody that makes all the choices, and then you can resent them for it, and then you can blame the fact that everything is wrong in your life. Well, you can say, well, they made me do it. They made me do it, right? And so, and they are making you to a point if you are a captive. I mean, of course, but in the typical situation with narcissist and empath of two adults, not people who are in the child-parent dynamic and not people who are kidnapped, they do have a choice, and they choose to stay in a very dysfunctional cycle, and they don't take responsibility for their part. They instead say, this horrible narcissist plays these games and makes me do this, and then I try to forgive them in this. At the end of the day, you're consenting to this by staying around this, because we all know that a person who does love and respect you, it would never occur to them to have this complete no regard and lack of consideration for your needs. Like, that's just not how it is. So to continually rationalize is another form of, it's kind of a masochism in a way. And it's a form of scapegoating, because then you don't have to be responsible. It's almost like the submissive can then just blame, oh, I'm at the whim of this man. Oh no. And that's how the erotica situations play out. They're at the whim of someone that kidnapped them. They're at the whim of a life or death situation. Of course, that's great. It's fun to read about. We need to have high stakes when we're reading, right? And so all of that tracks, but be careful. I wanted to make this a specific point because I've only focused on kind of glamorizing narcissistic doms and glamorizing emotional abuse, but I wanted to make sure that we also get into the psychology of the other side that's enabling that abuse, because they're so terrified of confrontation and negative emotion that they will just be like a slave and a martyr and a victim in order to kind of tell themselves that they have to, I have no choice. And so, anyway, I think it's an interesting thing to analyze. And it's interesting to analyze, too, how these characters are over and over again repeated. So they're important archetypes of kind of dynamics that happen in real life or that people crave for a reason. And it's because underlying them show a lot about what we're craving to kind of right. We're not craving to right or wrong in our past, or we're craving to have a kind of an experiencing to make something that felt like we couldn't get filled as a void, filled through this fantasy, filled through this type of dynamic. And it's always interesting to think about.